Okay, so we just relocated ourselves a little bit here, and I think we can get good shots of everybody. What were we, where were we? We were talking about...
The distinction between the core wound,
the
first and third noble truths.
This teaching and the noble truths in general. So yeah, the main point that I was trying to get to there is that it became evident to me that the progression in the evolution of human consciousness, if you want to use that phrase, that consciousness itself evolves. And, you can nitpick here, but our take on reality, our perspective has evolved, and this is more and more being acknowledged by a lot of people, and that what Buddha was able to bring in as a radical insight in his time was part of the foundation of what became, using language that may sound unduly critical, but it's what I call hypermasculine consciousness. By contrast to the relatively hyperfeminine. In other words, there was as humans evolved over millions of years, and then especially the last several 100,000 years. I mean, it's hard to say exactly, times. We were still largely embedded in nature without self-awareness, without significant self-reflective awareness. Through the period of hominid evolution of the last, several million years. And at some point, and certainly in the historical period, we see it in characters like the Buddha in India and the Upanishadic sages. We see it in the Greeks, certainly the Hebrew prophets. Karen Armstrong wrote a book called The Great Transformation, The Beginnings of Our Religious Traditions, which was a history, actually, of the axial age, what was called the axial age by Karl Jaspers, which basically is speaking of the time when certain recognitions of the nature of reality, of the divine, the call to moral compassion and self-sacrifice and integrity. And there's a whole infusion of higher virtues and values into human consciousness, much of which was explicitly spiritual, some of which was intellectual, moral, and so on. And it had different expressions and reverberations in different cultures in ancient times. So she cited Buddha also as one of the great progenitors of this new understanding. But my recognition about it has been that what that made possible was, or what it gave a kind of a culminating, crystallizing voice to, was the transition from being so embedded in nature that essentially our forebears were still coming out of the time when we were largely functioning like other herds of creatures, or flocks, or packs, where there was no strongly developed self-awareness. And that self-awareness grew in such a way that we were able suddenly not only to be self-reflective, to know the I over against the I of you, each of you, or anybody else, but also we could reflect on our relationship to our whole environment in ways that had not been possible before. And vastly oversimplifying this, and I talk about this might do a better job on the new DVD, Awake and Radiant. That's like in the first couple of passages. The vastly oversimplifying, the classic Eastern cultural response was to develop a genius of this is a karmic snake pit that just repeats itself again and again. Craving, the desire, the action to try to satisfy craving, the karmic results of that action, the next set of cravings, on and on and on, endlessly, lifetime after lifetime, is classic Eastern orientation to it. And the impulse coming out of that is, let me out of here. You know, the way to fix this is to achieve nirvana, which, as Adida pointed out in a book many years ago about Buddhism, Nirvanasara, he said, you know, what Buddha was essentially saying is, don't you get that all this craving, desire, seeking to satisfy cravings and the repetition of cravings, it's a great fire. And there is a quenching possible, which is the meaning of nirvana. And so this great quenching was one of the ways of describing a relief from the primary suffering of being alive and its root causes that involved an escape from the whole field. So, you know, Buddhism was extremely radical. Get out and stay out. You know, later on, the language came in of, well, I won't accept complete liberation from the total worlds, not just the physical world, but all of the potential realms of subject-object entanglement and craving and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I won't accept complete liberation from that until and unless everybody and everything comes along for the ride. You know, the ultimate bodhisattva impulse. And in the classic West, a parallel but different orientation arose. Again, vastly oversimplifying, because we see elements of both in both those cultures around the world, the great realms of culture, Eastern and Western. And of course something else is happening on the indigenous level. It might be a third great category we could talk about, but leaving that out for the moment. In the classic West, what developed was not a spiritual impulse based on the recognition of being at the mercy of nature and our own nature, but essentially an intellectual, and then gradually becoming more and more scientific one, of I can develop this self-awareness that puts my mind into play in relation to the phenomena that have been controlling me and other human beings, and we can defeat nature. We can subdue the world that has always subdued us. We can learn how it works, and as Sir Francis Bacon, we can torture nature's secrets out of her, put her to the rack. I mean, these guys. So yeah, some of them were they weren't very friendly to the feminine. But you see, that's actually the point. Now, you know, Wilbur himself took me to task on, don't you think there's better language for this than hypermasculine? And I've never felt at liberty to try to change that language. I don't like it. I don't feel it's fully sufficient. But there's an embeddedness in material nature that the hypermasculine impulse, both Eastern and Western, has arisen to overcome. You know, it's like it is a let me out of here in the classic West, to finish that point. Again, it's not to escape into some spiritual liberation from life altogether, but to control it, to dominate it, to learn how to make it so that nature serves us rather than the other way around. serves might not be the best word, but something like